Great. Good evening, everyone. Happy rainy Wednesday night. It's really wonderful that so many of you can join us tonight for this really important session. I want to thank our executive director, Mary McGrath, for putting this program together, and Mary for all your leadership in a trauma-informed and a safe and supportive environment in San Mateo County for our kids, for building that for our kids. Certainly looking forward to meeting and hearing from Leah Weiss tonight. I shared with her that I have her book on my shelf, How We Work, which is a way of understanding the habits that we have that maybe don't always contribute to best outcomes, and how we can be more efficient to serve our roles. But really, what we're doing tonight is taking a big step back and looking at the needs of our young people in the community. Yes, I didn't introduce myself, but I'm Nancy McGee, the County Superintendent of Schools in San Mateo. But really, I think of myself first and foremost as a parent. I have two children. They're men now, two boys that I raised as a single mom through most of my parenting career, while working, going to school, et cetera, et cetera. And raising those guys wasn't an easy task. And in fact, they challenged me more than I've been challenged in any way in any role I've ever had. And what I learned through being a parent with these particular children that helped me learn and grow is that I needed that they were also helping me expand who I was as a human being, that I didn't need to have all the answers, that I needed to listen and learn from them. And that I was a good parent in the middle of all of not knowing the answers and always having the right thing to say. Sometimes we beat ourselves up because we think we have all this control. And the fact of the matter is, our kids come into the world on their own journey, and our job is to help ferry them along on the journey. We're lucky if we can have that kind of interactive relationship where we learn and grow from each other, but in the end, their life, and they get to dictate their direction. So I think in this time, in pandemic time, in times of racial unrest, and where injustice is really front and center on our TV screens and in our lives, with kids not having connection to their peers the way they typically do, I think parents are in particularly worried about the health and longevity, the longevity of their success. How are our kids being harmed right now, and how are they being held back? In fact, this is an amazing opportunity for them to grow and become resilient human beings. So I'm really happy to turn it back over to Charlene and to Leah for a wonderful program. I want to thank all of you for being here. There's so many of you on the list. I do know that we have a county board member here, Chelsea Bonini, in the audience. So board member Bonini, thank you for supporting this work. I'm not sure if I've got other board members in the list. I haven't had a chance to look, but if I do, I'll say welcome to you through the chat. All right, thanks very much. Enjoy the program. I'll be listening. Back to you.
All right, thank you so much, Superintendent McGee. It was an honor to have you with us tonight. And thank you, Mary McGrath. Also an honor to work with you to present this program. We are thrilled tonight to be offering Dr. Leah Weiss in The Art of the Possible, Raising Resilient Children and Teens. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm founder of the Parent Education Series, now in its 16th year, and co-founder of the nonprofit, The Parent Venture. We are so excited. We know that this is an incredibly important and timely topic with more than 700 registered. We're used to getting pretty good turnouts for our events, but tonight is very special, and I think that attendance number shows it. If you need Spanish interpretation tonight, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a globe, and if you can click on the globe and then Spanish, Espanol, you will have interpretation. with Rosie Issel, who's with us tonight. Thank you, Rosie. So again, if you need Spanish, click on the globe and Spanish. All right, let me just tell you a little bit about how things are going to go tonight. We are grateful for the sponsorship of San Mateo County Office of Education, again, Superintendent McGee, and our partner in this program, Mary McGrath, who's Executive Director of Safe and Supportive Schools. We have about 45 minutes of content, and then we're going to open up the program to Q&A, meaning questions from you, the audience. So in the chat tonight, you'll be seeing links. My partner, Bev Hartman, will be operating the chat. If you have questions, we ask that you put them in the Q&A box. If you can, keep them kind of brief because we'd like to get to as many of your questions as we can. At the end of the night, there will be a very short survey. We hope that you will fill that out. We use it in our planning for future events. And also we really want to hear from you, the parents, educators, resource parents, and community members who are with us tonight. So again, thank you, everybody. Let me tell you a little bit about, before I leave and tell you about our presenter, I'd want to let everyone know that we do have another event tomorrow night with David Kleeman on digital media, kids media and COVID-19, what has changed, what hasn't, what's next. So for those of you, and that means all of you who are interested in online schooling and digital media, please do tune in for that, another free event. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's keynote presenter, Dr. Leah Weiss. Leah Weiss, PhD, MSW, created the perennially waitlisted course, Leading with Mindfulness and Compassion at Stanford Business School. She's a principal teacher and a founding faculty member of Stanford's Compassion Cultivation Program, conceived by the Dalai Lama. She is also the co-founder of Skylight, a company that specializes in data-driven, scalable solutions for organizational resilience. Her first book that Nancy McGee just mentioned, How We Work, Live Your Purpose, Reclaim Your Sanity, and Embrace the Daily Grind, published by Harper Wave, focuses on developing compassionate and soft-skilled leadership while also offering research-backed actionable steps toward finding purpose at work. It has currently been translated into 7 different languages. Her latest book, Bhavana, The Thai Secrets of Everyday Resilience, came out in 2019. Please join me in a really warm welcome for Dr. Leah Weiss. Thank you, Nancy and Mary. Take it away, Leah.
Thank you so much. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you all. And I'm finding myself a little bit nervous, which is kind of funny for me. I spend, way too much time talking and giving keynotes, but I think one of the things that signals for me is how important this particular conversation is. And I really resonate with Nancy's comment about parenting being one of the most primary and challenging roles. And so I am really excited for our dialogue tonight. I am going to share some slides, hopefully successfully. Does that look okay? So I want to start with a check-in question or several questions for you. I want to invite you to use the chat bar first to write down 3 words that capture how you are feeling right now. How are you doing? Like, honestly, really, how are you doing? 3 words so that you can have some oppositions in there or multiples. 3 words that describe how you're feeling about parenting tonight. And then I'd love if you could put in a comment about where you're joining us from. Where are you? And if you want to add in the age of your kids, that would be fantastic. So I'll give you a moment, 3 words, checking in for yourself and how you're feeling as a parent and where you're coming from. So, okay. Let's, and Bev, maybe you'll help me filter some of these over so I can see them. Oh, I see, it's in the chat. Sorry, my bad. Excellent. There we go. Let's take a look. Scroll through along with me. Tired, frustrated, burned out. I'm going to talk about all of those, 4 and 8. I'm tired. Do you see the word tired a lot? I'm seeing the word tired a lot. Frustrated, concerned, hopeful. worried, challenged. So a lot of similar words. Scroll through. I think that in itself is a bit cathartic, realizing that we are not alone. And I think that begs the first moment that I want to share together as a community right now, that we are all in the thick of a time when we're trying to parent through experiences we have never lived through. It's new for all of us. It is hard. And that we are not alone in that, that there's a shared experience that we are having, even if it's easy to forget that if we happen to be spending much of our time in the home these days. I want to share with you just a little very brief snippet of where the work that I'm going to be drawing from tonight comes from. I started studying this topic of resilience when I was an undergraduate at Stanford many moons ago. And I became very interested in contemplative practices as a resource for resilience. And then in more recent years, studying positive psychology principles like purpose and compassion and so forth. And so I've been teaching at the Graduate School of Business courses on leadership, and doing work in organizations on this topic of resilience, but always coming back again and again to what are the implications for the role of parenting. And so I want to suggest that as we have this discussion tonight, that we think with two hats. One, resilience for ourselves as parents in a really challenging time. And we need to, to use the cliche, put on our own oxygen masks so that we can be a resource for our children. And then we'll also be thinking about building resilience for our children. And I saw in the chats, and you probably noticed too, this exhaustion and burnout as a concept is coming up in this group. And I want to talk about it directly in opposition, if you will, for or as a basis to think about how do we build resilience. And I think it's really important to take this idea of burnout seriously, taking it seriously for ourselves as the caregivers, as the workers in the different roles we're in, but also kid burnout is a thing, especially now. We're seeing more and more literature about this in older children, younger children. I know my 3 children are 10, 7, and 6, and there's a lot of the signs of burnout that I'm seeing in them with respect to online education. So we can talk about some of that. So big picture, thinking about burnout, it is a massive problem, an order of magnitude alongside cancer. And it impacts productivity, profitability in the context of organizations. So it's something that there's a lot more attention and research being done on this topic. Even prior to COVID, it was already an issue, but COVID has magnified. And I think important for us to realize that burnout isn't just something that happens emotionally, it impacts us physically. And it impacts all of these systems in our body, like heart disease, the amygdala center of the brain, the old brain, or which sometimes described as the lizard brain. The threat center becomes enlarged when we're burned out. And so we literally have less cognitive resources, less ability to think and focus, and other health implications like accelerating aging, likelihood of diabetes. And it's important to realize that how COVID and this pandemic has really amplified our need for resilience. Many of us are struggling with economic insecurity. Loneliness is a massive issue. And it's amplified during the pandemic. 60% of people are saying that they feel lonely during the pandemic. And then, rates of domestic violence and so forth on the rise. And I know that for many folks in the school systems, this is a great concern, that the infrastructure that we've built to support children who are at risk is based on a world where they're coming to school. So how do we do that in this environment? How do we work with the fact that we are going through trauma right now? Our children are going through in their formative years, this adversity? How do we make sense of it, and with an eye towards resilience? How do we make sense of the challenges for just the basics, sleeping, eating, for many of our children and for us is a problem. And then, adding on in workplaces, changing work processes for kids, learning to use Clever and all the different, my kindergartner and first grader navigating this whole complex world of technology, or freaking out because they're struggling to navigate it, which then, of course, impacts us. So I name all this not to make us feel more overwhelmed, but actually to normalize that we are holding a lot as human beings and as parents. And it's why I want to keep coming back tonight to this idea of the art of the possible. And this is not a time where perfectionism or unattainable standards is helpful for us or for our children. That if we acknowledge all that we're holding, that flexibility and problem solving and changing our standards is going to be a really important adaptive approach. So I've been talking about this term burnout, and then I'm going to get into the resilience side further. But I just want to define what I mean by burnout so we can think about it for ourselves and also our children. So according to the World Health Organization, burnout entails these three components: emotional exhaustion. And that's kind of self-explanatory. Do any of you feel lately like you just don't have any more emotional resources to offer? You're drained? That's one component. Depersonalization is another way of saying we feel less like human beings, or we're not seeing the human side of others as clearly, which when our lives are mediated through screens and technology, it kind of is something that makes sense that it happens. So how do we build the humanization in? And then this burnout includes this sense of I can't influence my environment, lack of efficacy. So thinking about these three together, then we can start to look at the flip side of how do we build resilience in. And I love this quote, thinking about burnout is what happens when you try to avoid being human for too long. When we try to avoid being human, including feeling the fear or frustration or all of the responses that we would have in an adaptive way to these wild times that we're in. If we try to avoid feeling that or supporting our children to process that in some way, then we're actually contributing to burnout. And so we want to create these opportunities where we can be in our humanity together with them. And I think, without going through all the fine print, I want to just point out a couple of key things. Burnout isn't an on-off, it's a spectrum. In the early stages of burnout, look like workaholism, or for many of us. So from the parenting role, if we are finding ourselves cycling through into our work in an excessive way, or we start moving into displacing frustration in other relationships, maybe frustration from our work day, which, by the way, now for many people is the same place as our family life, noticing that these could be signs of burnout, and wanting to notice behavioral changes, withdrawal, changes in self-care. Those can all be signposts for burnout that we want to keep an eye on for ourselves and those around us. And then, thinking in terms of resilience, I want to put forward some thinking. Let's frame a little bit. What do we mean by resilience? So according to the American Psychological Association, resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant stress, such as family and relationship problems, health problems, workplace, financial stressors, global pandemics. As much as resilience involves bouncing back from these difficult experiences, it can also involve profound personal growth. And so I think, this idea of adapting is really important, that we're not going to get rid of the adversity. And there's a lot about the external environment we can't change, but we can do things about how we're responding. And there's an opportunity. And I think for me, when I think about myself as a parent, one of my fears is, what impact, what lifelong impact are all these challenges having on my children? And it's really helpful to think about, well, what opportunities for personal growth, for learning, for understanding processes about how we respond to the challenges we're all going to face throughout our lives. Another word for that is post-traumatic growth. So just knowing that that's possible, talking to our children about the fact that the strategies we're working to develop now and the strength we're developing now, these adaptations make us better and stronger than we would have otherwise been. Not that we chose these circumstances, but here we are. I also want to talk about, I think there's an important counterpoint to make here, that when we talk about resilience purely as an individual, we don't want to make it all of the pressure on the individual to do resilience in a vacuum on their own. And so this is actually a quote from Dr. Christina Masloch, who's one of the preeminent researchers in the topic of burnout. And she speaks about the context being important. So, and I think there's a powerful metaphor here we should be thinking about. We should be trying to identify and analyze the critical components of bad situations in which many good people function. Imagine investigating the personality of cucumbers to discover why they had turned into sour pickles without analyzing the vinegar barrels in which they'd been submerged. So recognizing that it is nonsensical to ask a cucumber not to become a pickle, but we need to think in terms of what can we do in the environment. Some of the resources that we need to be keeping in mind are beyond the individual. So what do I mean by that? If you look at these 4 pillars of resilience, many of them are interpersonal in nature. So I want to talk about each of these in turn. First, we need to have self-awareness if we want to be resilient. We need to know our triggers. We need to know our needs. We need to teach our children how to know these things for themselves. Purpose is if we have a strong sense of our why, that we can get through the challenges that we're facing. And we also need to have not just the self-awareness within ourselves, but ability to communicate with others what we need, what we want, what matters to us. And I know that there's another program coming up that's focusing on purpose, and I would highly encourage you to do that with Dr. Bronk, because purpose is an amazing superpower for resilience. Autonomy, such a challenging question for us as adults, and then thinking about this for our children. So I work often in team environments, but you can adapt this thinking in terms of a child in relation to their classroom, a child in relation to their family system. How do we get that right balance between giving them support and giving them freedom? And it's really difficult right now. I know, like with these 2 little boys that I have, both need a lot of support to do their online school, but there's, a numbers issue. We're outnumbered. There's more of them than us. And we want to encourage them to grow, but then we'll get into things like my 10-year-old's last report card, where we found out that, video off and maybe not there for large portions of the day. So, okay, we went too far in the flexibility and freedom side, and how are we going to understand she needs more support, let's call it. So these are the kinds of questions. We don't want to stifle our kids, and we also need to make sure that it will always be adapting. And from what I hear from those of you brave souls who are parenting teenagers, I mean, it sounds like I'll be coming to you for advice about how to do this in a few years. I'm joking / not joking. Structured rest. This is a critical part of resilience. And we are in a culture that is really bad at taking thoughtful approaches to rest. Many of us have forgotten how to rest or work in workplaces where the expectations are around the clock. Many of us don't know how to relax when we are off the clock. And it's a real challenge to relearn. And this is where some of the contemplative practice research, the mindfulness research and so forth is really interesting, because people, it seems we're losing our self-soothing, down-regulating capacity, and we have to retrain ourselves through meditation or other strategies, or many other strategies. But thinking about what are we doing to have a cadence of rest, and how are we teaching our kids about finding a way to learn how to do that themselves. And then this community piece is critical, and one of the most challenging parts right now, that across the developmental spectrum, children need community. They need to build together. They need to feel that they're included. They need to feel safe and to be themselves. They need to feel a sense of belonging. And what does that look like in a remote world? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. You know, and a lot of the work that I do is in the context of organizations, but these principles I think are really important to keep in mind, you know, thinking in terms of the child in the different units that they function in classroom and family, and thinking about the broader culture of the school, the organizations you're functioning within, and so forth. And all of these are important and factor into culture is a big part in our sense of belonging, and community is critical to building resilience. And so I want to get out of this kind of trap of thinking of resilience as something that's only about individual responsibility, individual mindset. That's all very important. There's no doubt about it. But we also need to think about the infrastructure and the systems level support for our children. You know, so I'm be curious to hear from you, and this could be something you could respond in the chat bar. You know, how are you feeling like you are doing, and your children are doing as individuals in the context of their classroom, or however you want to, your family system, in the school system or organizations you're functioning. If you think across these levels, how is it going? How are you being supported? And how are you feeling challenged? And I think problem solving across these levels it can be really empowering, because when you find the unit level, the team level, or the organizational level, that's also a place where you can collaborate with others to build strategies and find community in the building of these strategies. So, you know, a resource that you could use, and we'll post the link to this as a follow-up, I think really important for us to be thinking now and introspecting for ourselves, for our children. What are our strengths and weaknesses in terms of our personalities? And how do those factor into how we're resilient? So let me say a little more about what I mean by that. What motivates us? We're all a little bit different. Some of us are highly motivated by achievement, some motivated by community, collaboration, some motivated by cause. And then how do we cope? How do we cope with the stressors? Are we primarily internalizing self-criticism, externalizing, blaming? Are we avoidant? And so, you know, using tools like these, what I find is it's a really helpful conversation starter with our children, to be thinking about with them, you know, what's your personality like, and what are your defaults? So, you know, this is a system that's developed with adults in mind. And just to give you a sense, so let's say that you are motivated by causes, and then you're highly self-critical as a coping strategy. So what does that then imply for you? If you're a reinvestor, you're gonna, this typology, your strengths will be, working hard and being mobilized by big picture and wanting to have impact. Challenges might be the potential for workaholism, proclivity for workaholism. The more stressed, the more self-critical, the more you work. And so knowing this about yourself, building that self-awareness can help you to understand what you need to put in place. Others who, if you're a distract or avoidant type, which my oldest is more like that, I have to keep an eye on her because she's not going to throw herself back into her project. If she gets frustrated or overwhelmed, she's going to hide out from it. So ultimately, I need to help her understand that that's what she needs to look at for herself, but we're not quite there yet, given that she's 10. So I've got to help her do that in the meantime. But think about building that autonomy. And so, I think when we think about using these kinds of analysis, it's really trying to unpack, what do I need? How am I interacting with my children? What do they need? And then how do we work together as a system? And so some of the questions, when we do work like this, thinking about what makes sense to us about where we are, if we find that we are an internalizer and we have a proclivity towards workaholism, is that always, or is that right now within the context of COVID? Are there things that are strengths that we really want to play up? And are there weaknesses, like I mentioned for my daughter, we want to keep an eye on? I think important as we think about these 4 pillars, to also really pay attention to this community pillar, because it's the part that many of us, are really acutely missing, and our children are missing. And coming back to this point that I made before about loneliness, the former Surgeon General, who's now part of Biden's team, he has a book that just came out on this topic of loneliness called Together, and it's full of fascinating research about the health implications of social isolation. And one of the statistics that has really stayed with me is, for people who are socially isolated, it's the equivalent of smoking 10 cigarettes a day. On your health, the equivalent is massive. We are social creatures. So understanding the implications and trying then to create belongingness as a strategy for resilience. And this has been something that there's been a lot of really interesting research coming out of Stanford and beyond. How do you create, what does it mean for youth to feel like they belong, and what can you do to help them feel that way? And so I think this definition of belonging is really helpful to think about. Belonging happens when we feel like we're treated fairly, like we're respected, like we're connected to the people we spend time with, and like we're contributing to meaningful outcomes through our work. And so if we pause and think about that, what does it look like to amplify that right now for our children? And to pay attention to this sense of when there's a feeling of exclusion and I don't belong, or I'm not respected, or I'm not being treated fairly, that these are related directly to the capacity for resilience. So we don't want to overlook these concerns. We want to really address them. And I think it's not just about making our kids feel better. They need to feel sense of belonging to perform. In the workplace, we know that employees who have a higher sense of belonging, they're more engaged and they also have better health outcomes. And students who have a higher sense of belonging perform better academically as well. But, easier said than done in remote environments. And this is definitely something I'm happy to spend some more time on. I think this comes back to the point that when we don't know how we fit in with others, it takes up our cognitive resources, and that makes it challenging to learn. And I know this is something that I've heard my children in their different ages and different ways talk about. My first grader, when I asked him about his day, in the beginning of the year, I was in habits of asking about his friendships, and he's like, I don't know if I have friends. We don't talk to each other. He just doesn't even know how to make sense of what does friendly behavior even look like in a context where he's muted much of the day. So that was like, a profound reality check in terms of parenting and what does this look like? And, I think the other place that we can put a lot of attention now too is on the small interactions and how important they are. And the fact that we can leave this trace that makes the other person better off through these small interactions, and that helping our children focus on them in the context of even remote learning and so forth, or sibling relationships or whatever engagements they are having, that these small points matter and that we can help highlight them. So, what I would want to encourage, I'm going to go back to this 4 pillars slide. And when you look at this and you think about yourself in terms of putting on your own oxygen mask, where are you with where you think you would want to focus, and remembering that modeling is such an important component of how we teach our youth, what we show them. And what do you think in terms of where you would want to focus your efforts with your children? Is it amplifying? Is it talking more about purpose and helping them get more clear about what does matter and what can they influence from home in this world that they're occupying right now? Or is it working on a sense of belonging or compassion? Where do you think would make the most of a difference for them? And, I think really important when we're thinking about building resilience, that we think in terms of behaviors. So we want to think about these 4 pillars. Like, we're not going to be able to go off and make all of the changes on, the emotional intelligence and the purpose, alongside working on an autonomy piece, alongside thinking about rest and strategies for rest and community. So picking something small, making it really super tiny, as Dr. Fogg puts it, making it part of the routine. And also focusing on the positive emotions that are connected with that experience. So if we're focusing on increasing autonomy for our children and agency and giving them more flexibility, like maybe having the conversation with them about what would be a meaningful starting place, a small difference that you could experiment with that would be a part of their daily life, and then making sure to connect with the positive emotional piece of it, the impact it has on them, and to understand what difference it's making as they go. So I think what I'd love to do at this point is move into some questions, because it looks like there's a bunch of questions and comments in the chat. So will you help guide me on that, Charlene?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Leah, for a really wonderful presentation. I can tell from the chat, from all the comments that you have been sending in, everybody, that this is really resonating for you all. And it's not easy. It's not easy for anybody. I mean, we're feeling that kind of overwhelm from parents for their kids, for the loss of community. Like you said, kids who don't know how, they don't even know if they're making friends. I talked to somebody yesterday who said her grandchild was trying to climb in to his cousin's little box on the Zoom screen because he wanted to play with her. So it's so disorienting for all of us, for parents, for kids, for educators. So let's just start with a few questions, Leah, and see where we go. We have lots of really good questions. So here's a parent who writes, I'm worried that the pandemic and school at home for almost a year has reduced my child's resilience and increased their dependence on us, his parents. What are your thoughts? Do you think this is going to be a good thing in the end or a not good thing?
Yeah, I mean, for me, such an important question, and why I find myself coming back to that definition of resilience again and again. That the American Psychological Association's definition that has this. It's about adapting to adversity and learning the skills and having the confidence that we know how to adapt to adversity. And then also that there's growth possible through all of this. And I think that, in my kind of existential fear as a parent, when I go to the place of, what is this going to do in the long run? I find it's not just self-soothing, although it does calm me down, which is a nice benefit, but I think it makes a lot of sense. And if, I find myself reading a lot of books about, World War II and the Holocaust and resilience in the face of extreme situations, because it really does drive home this point that people, and particularly children, we have these tools of resilience. Our biology is resilient. And I think, the frame that we bring to it, reminding ourselves that we can do hard things. That was one of the phrases that my son, who was acting out a bit, had some great sessions with the guidance counselor at his school, and he walked away with this phrase, I can do hard things. And I love that. I say that to myself now a bunch of times during the workday or when I'm trying to exercise. It's such a great frame. We can do hard things. They can do hard things. And if that becomes their mindset, then all of this that we're going through, could lead to massive growth for them. But if we see them as damaged and ourselves as damaged and have that perspective, then that's what they're going to pick up on for us. So it puts a lot back on us as parents to check our own mindset and what are we communicating here? Is this something we're going to learn about ourselves, learn we can do these hard things, we can do them together and move on.
Oh, it's such a good point, Leah. I listened last week to filmmaker Ken Burns talking with historian Doris Goodwin with Anderson Cooper, and Ken and Doris were both saying, remember, in the middle of hard times, whether the Depression or World War II, people didn't know things were going to work out. So it's up to us. It's up to us, parents, kids, community members, to be that, to be strong, to say to ourselves, we can do this, because that's the only way it's going to get done. All right, here's a related question, not an easy one. Speaking of your pillars, Leah, here's a parent who writes, remote school has shattered the community pillar entirely for my kids. What suggestion do you have for parents to bring community into the home? I think that's a great question.
Yeah, I think it's so much of this. One of the reasons I like this definition of belonging, the idea that it has these different components. It has to do with what am I contributing as much as how am I being seen. And I think looking for opportunities when I do it differently for my different kids, my two little boys, out of just need, I really emphasize their relationship and like, this interaction between these three siblings. For my older daughter, she really wants to be relating externally. So it's been a lot of negotiating things like playing online games that I'm honestly not that excited about, but that's become her way of FaceTiming while playing a game that we never, it's not a dangerous game, but I'm just not excited about it. And looking for methods with her at different points along the way. It's been trying to find safe social distance ways to get together. And then there's been other times we haven't been comfortable with that because of the rates in our community of COVID. And so I think, situating to for them that this is a point in time, reminding them that all of their friends are also going through this. Because I think for my oldest, one of the stories, she gets into the story of like, I'm being excluded for something that's happening, and reminding her everybody is having this experience at home in their homes. So it's not like there's a world that's going on that she is separate from. All of the kids are going to have to figure out how to go back to school at some point, and that's going to be awkward and exciting and scary for all of them. And that seems to help her to just keep kind of remembering that they're all going through this in parallel, and try to find some ways, depending on your comfort level, whether it's online activities, that you can, it's some way of having these small group interactions. And maybe for us as parents, compromising a little bit, like there's way more Roblox happening in my house than is ideal. That's a fact.
Absolutely. Fair enough. So a parent asks, how do you cultivate a sense of belonging in your kids given the pandemic? And I think you just touched on that, but would you suggest, again, letting your kids know that this is a shared experience? We miss our friends too. Parents are also feeling that lack of connectedness.
Yeah, I mean, I think that anything we could do to bring out this kind of common humanity frame, try to emphasize the family unit as much as possible. But I talked to some of my friends who have one child, and or single mom who's working full time and has one child. Like the situations vary, and I think it's finding some way, whether that's through a pod or through an activity in the school, that there's some smaller group that they can interact with, is really, as much as we can support them in that, or if it can be siblings or family or extended family. I do a lot of my mother's in another location, but I do a lot of kind of putting her on the phone with my daughter, just because it's a person to spend some time with who's not me, and she's so sick of talking to me. So kind of enlisting some of those other people in our lives and extended family as much as we can.
I think that's great advice. Anna Hamoyan suggests that too. Maybe it's grandma or an uncle or a niece or nephew who can help you through a bad patch of homework, right? Doesn't always have to be the parent, could be somebody else. So, Leah, you mentioned the family unit, and here's a question from a parent who's a resource parent. She asks, what suggestions do you have for increasing the resilience of foster youth? It's been a really hard year for foster kids and resource parents like me. Many kids are out of school and not getting the help they need.
Yeah. Um, well, I think, it's so important for all of us to remember that this is not an ideal time and right now, and to give ourselves as much of a break as we can to do our best with what we have. And I'm a big fan of being transparent with my kids about my limitations, and I've found that actually, for some reason, seems to really help them. And I'm just like, my heart is breaking with you right now. I wish I could give you what I would love to, you would need with other people and relationships and resources. But here we are. We've got, these constraints, and it's been really difficult, I think, for many of us, what having children who need tailored education plans. I've been trying to work with the school on that, and doing this all remotely and having the meetings and trying to understand what resources are available is really challenging. Um, and I don't have any silver bullets for it, other than the fact that I've been finding that when I just try to go into these conversations with the school, with the folks who are helping us with resources, um, with giving the benefit of the doubt that everyone's trying to do the best within this wild time, we get to some better options than the ones that we otherwise think of. And that metaphor that Nancy used in the intro of the tsunami that we're navigating, I think, is a really powerful one. We're not going to make the tsunami go away, but if we can keep an eye on shared purpose, caring about these children, and doing our best with massive limitations, I hope that that helps them with their coping with adversity and recognizing the need to stretch and grow.
Thank you, Leah. It's really important advice. Um, Here's a comment from a parent that I think really will resonate with lots of folks. This person writes, I think what's really hard for a lot of parents with kids in high school is trying to figure out what's important. Should we care more about academics? What if they aren't doing well? I mean, does that really matter for college, or are our relationships with our kids more important?
Yeah,
It's a really tough question.
it's such a great question. It, I've been doing some volunteer alumni interviewing for Stanford, and talking to some high schoolers in that context, and just trying to wrap my mind around what it means to be in that phase of life at this moment in time. I mean, I think we need to recognize that first things first, and making sure our kids are okay has to be primary. And um and I think that there's so little that we can do in the context of social relationships and other supports, that we don't want to let our relationships deteriorate if we can help it. And but it's hard to understand. I don't have a simple answer for that, but I would say my instinct would be relationship is primary. Um and in that the admissions processes and the grades and all of this stuff, everyone looking at it understands that there's a whole lot of grains of salt that need to be factored in. Yeah.
I know. I've been telling parents, Leah, that AP calculus will come and go, but our relationships with our children must remain. And in some ways, it's helpful just to think of it that way. It's hard,
Yeah.
but it's really important to remember that, right? So I also want to remind viewers that we have a free free video library with almost 70 videos on YouTube on a whole range of subjects: social emotional learning, social justice, communication. We have parent forums that are recorded with good tips about communicating with your kids, with experts of the caliber of Dr. Weiss. So please do check that out. We'll put it again in, it's in the chat, and we'll be sure to send that link to you too. So Leah, several parents, actually a number of parents, have been asking a similar kind of question. Do you have any advice for parents who have kids who are anxious or depressed? One parent writes and says, my daughter feels like she is the only one with ADHD. I know you have some personal feelings about this. Any suggestions with regard to resilience?
Yeah. And we've been trying to navigate this in our home as well, with anxiety. I think acknowledge I'm finding that it's helpful to acknowledge my kids that, like, with the particular style of mind you have, this is like a really bad fit for you in terms of a learning environment, to be on a screen all day. And so we know that this is making it's hard for everybody, and it's really hard for you, and kind of encouraging them to also look for, because of the tendency to feel alone in that experience, like, notice how many other kids in your class seem like they might be struggling, and like even that is actually a relief. And maybe that means, like, misery loves company, but I think it's actually the opposite. I think it's just this like common humanity piece. And when we compare ourselves to others, we don't actually know what's going on with them. So kind of using this conversation with our kids as a way to highlight that everybody's working with challenges right now. A lot of them are invisible, a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, and you're not alone in that. And kind of encourage them to find ways to notice that, and find others they can relate to. And I feel like that seems to somewhat help. And I think about a term like depression, and you have to ask some of these big picture questions now of, like, some behaviors that wouldn't be adaptive in other contexts kind of make sense now given where we are. So I don't know, diagnostic criteria in these terms. I don't mean to be flippant about giving our children support and giving ourselves support, but I think there's a lot of just context to pay attention to and be patient with, in a long view, like you said, Charlene, with the AP calculus. I think that's wise.
Well, and we recently had Dr. Aaron Nafak on with us, and he's a developmental pediatrician who sees a lot of kids who are really struggling right now. And he says he's talked to many kids and parents and basically said to them, you have 2020, or now I guess you have 2021, that it's really often situationally appropriate to be anxious right now. And you can tell that to your kids, right? You can, as you say, you can go after it, have those conversations with your children directly.
Yeah. And I think being honest about where we are, I'm grappling with this too. I am exhausted. I also cannot believe it's another Monday and I'm going to be staring at my screen all day. I'm right there with you. Like, what can we do to make this a little bit better and do it together?
All right, Leah, we have time for a couple more. I thank everybody who questions are just pouring in, Leah, more questions than we've ever had. So thank you to everybody who's asking. I wish we could do this all night, but to respect everyone's time, a parent asks, how do we encourage resilience with our kids in everyday life? Do you have a snapshot or a questionnaire to kind of check in on this? You had mentioned something earlier.
Yeah, I think that bringing conversations back, even I love the kind of dinner time conversation starters of, around what was tricky today and how did you navigate, and what did you learn from that, to kind of bring this stuff out and also share it ourselves. And I think just normalizing, what are we doing I can do hard things, and what are the examples of the hard things I did today? And even if it was just, showing up and keeping the video on for class all day, that's a win for, one of my kids these days. Like, yeah, so making it bite size, kind of back to this tiny habits idea, picking something really tiny that you can succeed at and talking to them about it, and also letting it be okay for them to fail at it, and then talking about that and trying a different strategy the next day, and making things smaller, one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, one priority, and letting some of the others go.
A year ago, when we were having talks about resilience, many parents were worried that their kids hadn't had enough challenges, that they were concerned that maybe they hadn't gone through enough. What would they write about on their college essay? I don't think we're worried about that anymore. And we'll be able to look back, I really believe, and say to our kids, look what we did. We got through this, right? So Leah, last question. I love to ask this one. It came from Becky Beacom, my friend from Palo Alto Medical Foundation. And it is, what gives you hope right now? What gives you hope?
Yeah, I think the creativity, these, small acts of creativity, or the small moments where my boys are not, hitting each other over the head, but they're playing with together for a few moments, and just making sure to pay attention to the little craft projects, the times they do help each other rather than the many times a day they didn't.
Oh, well, thank you. So listen, a huge thank you to you, Dr. Weiss, and to Mary McGrath for helping make this possible, and Superintendent McGee for joining us tonight. So thank you, Leah. Again, this video is being recorded and will be available free on our YouTube channel, Video Library. So again, we hope you'll take a minute to fill in the survey. The link is in the chat. We promise we read everyone. It really does help us with future planning. And this has been incredibly helpful and useful tonight. So Leah, bless you, take care, and stay well. See you all soon, everybody.